Hey everyone, Wazoo back here with another video on Java Spring Boot. In this episode, we're going to start working on a to-do app, but it's not like your traditional to-do app. Don't at me. Hey everyone, here we are back at start.spring.io, and this is the usual project entry point for creating any Spring Boot Java application. So let's get started with what we want to build. Okay, first of all, we want to select a Maven project. We want to make sure Java is selected, of course. For Spring Boot, I'll be using 2.5.2. And for the group name, I think I'll just use com.ericuswa. And then artifact will be Spring Boot to do. And then I can just give this a description of demo project for Spring Boot. Fun. Okay, and so here's the package name that we're given. Packaging, I'm going to leave it as a jar file. That way we can just run it right from the command line. For Java, we'll use Java 16. And for dependencies, let's select a few fun dependencies. So we'll use the Spring Boot Dev Tools. We'll make use of those. Let's add Lombok. We'll also need that. Lombok is used, if you haven't used it before, Lombok is used for providing shortcuts, annotation shortcuts to standard getters and setters in your Java objects, which really cleans up the look of all your models and some of your controllers. Spring Boot DevTools really comes in handy when you're doing local development because it can restart your server and recompile classes as you update them, which just makes local developing a whole lot quicker and easier. Spring Web, we'll need to make use of those. That will include all of our REST type of interfaces for Spring Boot, as well as it has a embedded Tomcat server that we can make use of when running right from the command line. Okay, and so let's also make use of, where is it now? I guess I could find it directly. Let's use Spring Data JPA, as well as, okay, you know what? I'm going to search for it, as well as the H2 database. Okay, so let's make sure that we've got our minimum. Okay, that looks good. So let's go ahead and hit the generate button
2 hours
and download that zip file. Okay, so here we are in Visual Studio Code. I've extracted the project folder, or the project zip file, sorry, that was generated from start.spring.io. And here we are right in Visual Studio Code. I've tried to make it more readable as we do some editing, but apologies if some of the text is hard to make out, or maybe some of the pop-ups, that the normal UI pop-ups that Visual Studio gives you when you hover over things. Sometimes I find that kind of gets in the way when I'm doing these kind of recordings. So I'll be putting all the source code up on my GitHub. I'll post a link in the description down below. And that'll let you open it up for yourself and follow along with what we're doing. Okay, so first of all, let's take a look at our project outline. We've got a source folder tree with our main Java com ericuswa Spring Boot to do folder and Spring Boot to do application.java, which is our main Spring Boot application entry point, as noted here with the annotation of @SpringBootApplication. So this is our main class that gets executed upon startup. Back in our resources folder, we have things like our application.properties file, which is essentially configuration options that we can set up for use with our Spring Boot server. We'll be going through a few of those as we add functionality within this application. And then we've also got the ability to add some static and template files to the resources folder. We've got a test folder tree to run through some tests, any tests that we want to set up with our project. Then back in the root folder, we've got mvnw and mvnw.command, and so these are helpful files for working with Maven right in the command line without needing to download or have Apache Maven somewhere in your path tree. So you can just execute these right from the root of your project. And then of course, last but not least, we've got the pom.xml file, which is a layout of all the configuration and dependencies and any build sort of flags that we need to have set up when working with our project. So we can define things here such as what version we're working with, description, what kind of Java version dependency we have, as well as our library dependencies, which are all listed here. So before we add anything in, let's go down here to our Spring Boot dashboard. I've got okay, maybe I'll highlight that first. In the extensions, which one is it? It's up in here. Okay, so in the extensions for Visual Studio Code, I have the Spring Boot. Let's get down to it here. We'll get to it. Okay, the Spring Boot dashboard, which I think is part of the Spring Boot extension pack. So I recommend these two extensions if you're working in Visual Studio Code. I'll try to remember to make a note of those in the description down below as well. But they're here, and they give you they have a nice integration to let you run your server right from within Visual Studio Code, as we're doing right here. Okay. So now another part of the Spring Boot dashboard extension is before you see our application options show up here underneath the Spring Boot dashboard menu item, it first needs to build under Java projects. And this is another way of it downloading any needed dependencies and doing a first build on the code base. So here we are, we have our Spring Boot to-do application at last. So under the extension, if we just click the debug run button, then it'll go through and start up our server for us. And by default, we should be listening to port 8080, as we've gone through in some of my other Spring Boot tutorials. And so let's go ahead and open a browser, and let's check out localhost port 8080. Okay, and we get our familiar white label error page. This is normal. This means that the Java Spring Boot server is up and running for us. So we can leave this running for now, the server I mean, just to show you what the DevTools is doing for us. So let's go back to our application code, and then let's talk for a few minutes about what I'm visualizing as the actual application here that we're going to be working on. One of the main common applications that a beginner or anyone really will use when either looking at a new framework, or perhaps they've got some experiments that they've got in their head that they want to test out, then a good application to do that with is a to-do application. And this is a nice, I won't say easy, but it's a nice first application, set of applications that you can create for yourself, which really demonstrate some of the framework that you're using. It helps you get familiar with how maybe things are interconnected and services, etc., are working within your application. So I think it's a really great application to write for yourself when learning something new, especially something like Ruby on Rails or Java Spring Boot. So a to-do application ours will have a server backend in Java Spring Boot, and then we will have some web pages that will contain web forms, which will just enable us to add to-do items to our lists, or we can edit those items, or we can remove them, call them done. We can also, what I want to get into is adding multiple users, so a user can log in and create their own to-do lists. And then I wanted to add some other functionality afterwards, which I think would be a really cool showcase for kind of putting everything into this one to-do app, but we'll go through all that later. So first things first, we've got our application up and running, and let's think about some data models. So I think out of the box, we are going to get started with a to-do item and a to-do list. And so we won't bother with users yet, but those are coming soon. And so a to-do list will have multiple to-do items. And then eventually a user will have multiple to-do lists. So in our head, we can already start to imagine some of the database configuration that we're modeling, that we're going to be going through for this application. But I want to try and start it little by little and just kind of add to it as we're going, to hopefully help you get familiar with kind of each step of the process. So first things first, let's just create a base to-do item. Okay, so in our root Spring Boot folder, source main java com Eric Uzois Spring Boot to do, I'm just going to refer to that as the source root from now on. I think that's a much easier shorthand versus saying that all over again. So within that source root folder, let's go ahead and create a folder called models. Okay, and then within the models folder, let's create a new file, and let's just call it TodoItem. Okay, TodoItem.java. Now, because we're making use of a Java project in Visual Studio Code, it's already given us our proper package name as well as a class, which is really cool. And so what I want to start with is giving it a entity annotation, because we're making use of Java persistence. Okay, so every to-do item is going to be needing a ID, and it's going to be needing a description and maybe some date variables attached to it. So when we created it, when we last updated the to-do item, and when we've actually that would be the only two we need. So let's get started. So first things first, let's give it an ID. We forgot one thing here. So our any entity that we want to make use of, our Spring Data JPA, needs to implement serializable. I always spell it wrong, so I'm really happy that it shows up in the online help. Okay, so you know what? Let's close this console here, because our space is already at a premium. Okay, maybe we can just do that. Okay, perfect. Okay, so we're going to give this the ID annotation. Okay, and we're going to give it a generated value. Okay, and the strategy I want to use is called generation type auto. And don't be too concerned with this. It's just kind of a annotation for the type of ID that we're looking to generate. So basically, it's like you can specify what kind of IDs you want to generate, and we're just going to use the basic generation type auto, which just creates these as 1, 2, 3, basically a sequence, a database sequence. Okay, and then let's make use of Lombok with the use of getter and setter annotations, and this means we won't have to write actual getter and setter functions for each variable that we're going to be putting in our model, which, thank goodness. Okay, so let's call this private long ID. Okay, perfect. And then now we're going to need a description. So let's do a getter and a setter annotation again with private string description. Okay, and then let's do a getter and setter for private Boolean completed. Okay, and let's do using dates with Java is always fun, so I'm sure we'll have a good time when we work with this. So let's store these as instant variables, and we'll call this date created, and we'll generate a timestamp as soon as an object is created, as soon as a to-do item is instantiated. Sorry, I'll have to be a little bit more precise there. Okay, so let's call this private instant date modified, And we'll also, okay, oops, that doesn't look like right Java. Okay, so let's control period that. We'll import, we'll set all our imports. Okay, so everything looks okay so far. Generation type, okay. Serializable from java.io. Okay, so we've got our basic object created here. Okay. And so now each model, what we also need is a repository for it. So back in our, and this repository in Spring Boot, if you're unfamiliar with it, is it creates basically a programmable, to my best way to describe it in my head, is that it creates an object link between the model and the actual database. So the repository is sort of an interchange, an intersection point between the two to communicate with the data and allow Java Spring Boot to map that data to the models that you have in your system. So back in your folder tree, in your project root tree, sorry, let's go into Spring Boot. Oops, I wonder, it looked a little bit weird there. Let's go back to our actual folder. Okay, and so we've got the models folder that we just created. Let's go ahead and create a repositories folder. So each model usually needs, if it's an actual database table, then it needs an associative repository class. You can generate lots of models which you use maybe in memory of your application, which a lot of projects do. But if there's any corresponding database table, then you'll need a repository object with it. Okay, so let's call this one TodoItemRepository. Okay, and so we are going to be working with the interface, public interface TodoItemRepository, and we are going to implement a CRUD. No, we'll use a JPA repository of import our TodoItem object. Okay. And so this gives us a way of making a mapping between our model and our data table. Okay. So we've got these things. Now, if you haven't been paying attention, or at least if you're not using the huge font like I'm using in this project, whenever you update and save a file, the server itself will be restarting because we've left it running. This should be a TodoItem first, and then the long. And this long is it's usually the when you're working with the repository, the second parameter of this repository description usually matches the key type that you have for the ID for the model that you're creating this repository for. So for example, if our key back in our TodoItem model, let's go back to it. If our key up here, if our ID key up here was a string instead of a long, so maybe we want to have like an alphanumeric string as our ID, then back in the repository, this long parameter will be a string instead. Okay, so this should have been updated by now, and everything looks like it's restarted smoothly now. Okay, and we can verify that and just go back and refresh our white label error page. Okay. Cool. So that was the first model that we're working with. Pretty exciting. Haven't actually done anything with it yet, but we've got a model in there, we've got a repository, so something is happening. Okay. So now what we should do is let's make a page controller for displaying some of the HTML. Okay, so back in our source tree, let's go to the root, our source root again, and let's create another folder and let's call it controllers. Okay, and then within that, let's create a new file and just call it PageController. And maybe what we'll do here is this will be a generic controller file for any kind of page that we want in our application. So maybe if we have like an about page, or if we have a anything like that, we'll be adding it here. So let's call this a controller. We'll be using the controller annotation. You know what? Let's actually use the REST controller. Okay. So we've got a REST controller that we're using here. Okay. And so let's use the default route is just a slash. So let's use a get mapping and call it a slash. And what we want to do is let's go ahead and return a string, and I usually call my entry point URL the root, but you can call it anything you want. So you can say like maybe get home or get welcome. You know what? Let's just leave it as get welcome. How about that? Okay. And let's return, just for now, we're returning a string. Whoops. Return welcome to to-do. Okay. So we're returning a basic string. Oops. Let's fix this mapping with control period. Import get mapping. Okay, we'll let our server restart. We need to make use of the controller annotation here instead of REST controller. My bad. Okay, so what's going to happen is it will receive a GET request for our slash, which is our default root, our root URL to our web application, and it'll just return the string welcome to to-do. So let's go ahead and refresh our web page. The text is not showing up. Our welcome to do text is not showing up because we haven't specified our database settings yet. So back in our resources folder, we've got a application.properties file, and this is the main way that we can configure a Spring Boot server and application. And so I think that's all we're missing is some default configuration options, and once we have that resolved, then we'll see the proper text that I'm looking for from our controller. At least that's my theory. Okay, so first of all, I usually like to create a standard server port across the servers I'm working on. So let's update the server port, and we'll call this server.port is 3000. Okay, so from now on, our server port will be listening on port 3000 instead of 8080. But you can use whatever number you love. Maybe 9000, 8080 is the default, so you can come up with anything else you want. And let's go ahead and configure our H2 database. And so let's call spring.dataSource.url. You know you're on the right track when you start typing in a configuration and the IntelliSense code completion stuff kind of kicks in, thanks to the Spring Boot dashboard and the Spring Boot extensions. Okay, so we're going to be storing this into a file for now, and let's do file, and then we're going to call this .data, and then call it to-do. Let's just call it to-do app. Okay, and then spring.dataSource.driver class name, and we're going to go ahead and call it org.h2.driver, and then let's go ahead and spring.dataSource.username, and we'll just use admin as username and password, and I'll show you what this looks like. Or I'll show you where we bring this into effect. Okay, password equals admin. Okay, and then spring.jpa database platform equals org hibernate dialect h2 dialect. And then let's enable the startup of h2 console. So spring.h2 console enabled equals true. And what we're going to need is automatic table creation when every time we restart our server. So it's something that we need to turn off later, so that we don't reset our to-do data every single time we restart our app. But for now, it's going to be really handy when we're doing our development. So spring.jpa.hibernate ddl auto equals create. Okay, so let's go ahead and save that. And our server will restart. And we get an error. Okay, of course. Always happens during a demo, right? Org.hibernate dialect h2 dialect. Okay, I don't think we need that semicolon. That's probably what's going on here. Okay, so let's restart it. PageController. Okay, so we've got our text, welcome to to-do. So instead of returning welcome.todo, let's just go ahead and return welcome. And then what we will do is in the resources folder under, I always forget which one it is. Let's try templates. So under templates, let's create a new file. Let's call it welcome.html. And let's just say welcome. Okay, so in our controller, we've got a mapping here, and we're returning a single string, welcome. And the way Spring Boot does some of the resolution is that if you have an HTML file in your templates folder, it'll look for the same name as the one that you're returning here from this controller. So that means theoretically, if we restart, so let's go ahead and stop our server, and we're going to need to add one more dependency to our project. And this is a good way of showing you how to add a dependency. And so we could have added this during our generation on start.spring.io, but let's create a new dependency object here, and we'll call it a group ID of org spring framework.boot, and we are going to be using the artifact ID of Spring Boot starter thime leaf. And this will help us do a lot of the markup and front-end work that we want to do for our application. So let's go ahead and if we save it, by default the Maven should be pulling down this dependency because of our Spring Boot extensions that we've got in the app. Okay, so now let's make sure this fixes our issue. So if we go back in and restart our Spring Boot to-do project, okay, and let's refresh our page, and we now get welcome. That's pretty cool. So now we've got our welcome string, which is really from our welcome HTML file. So let's make sure that we're returning what we think we're returning, and let's just update the text in here to something really recognizable. Okay, welcome to the HTML file. So this is where we can put some of our HTML that we need, our form stuff, as well as display our to-do item lists. So that's it for this episode. I think we've made a lot of great progress here. We've created our Spring Boot to-do application from a start.spring.io template. We've created a to-do item model as well as its associative repository object, as well as configuring a local H2 database for us, and even a welcome page through a PageController that we've added into the project. So stick around for the next episode and we'll just keep adding to this one until we've got our to-do list with a couple of cool add-ons that I'm thinking of adding. Until then, have a really great day. Peace, y'all.